If you found out someone you were considering for a job on your team or in your house or coaching your kids or walking your dog or driving a school bus, if you found out that candidate got so drunk that people had to use a battering ram, normally used by SWAT teams, to get into his room and wake him up, would you still hire that person for any job? Babysitter, dog walker, assistant? Well, how about the head of our nation's top law enforcement agency? There's extraordinary, alarming, brand new reporting on how many people inside the FBI allegedly fear that the current FBI director, Kash Patel's erratic behavior is now a threat to public safety, with allegations that have led Kash Patel to fire back against them with a defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic. Citing more than 12 sources, The Atlantic is today reporting on a series of alarming alleged episodes during Kash Patel's tenure at the FBI that have led officials to fear that the FBI is not ready to handle the many national security threats the country's facing, especially at a time when the Trump administration has launched a war with a regime that is a state sponsor of terrorism around the world. Here's just one of the alarming episodes reported. Quote, on Friday, April 10th, as FBI Director Kash Patel was preparing to leave work for the weekend, he struggled to log on to an internal computer system. He quickly became convinced he'd been locked out, and he panicked, frantically calling aides and allies to announce that he'd been fired by the White House. That's according to 9 people familiar with his outreach. 2 of these people described his behavior as a, quote, freak out. News of his emotional outburst ricocheted through the Bureau. The White House fielded calls from the Bureau and from members of Congress asking who was now in charge of the FBI, end quote. And then there's the allegations around his drinking. Multiple officials telling The Atlantic this, quote, he is known to drink to the point of obvious intoxication. Early in his tenure, meetings and briefings had to be rescheduled for later in the day as a result of his alcohol-fueled nights. On multiple occasions in the past year, members of his security detail had difficulty waking Patel because he was seemingly intoxicated, according to information supplied to Justice Department and White House officials. A request for, quote, breaching equipment, normally used by SWAT and hostage rescue teams to quickly gain entry into buildings, was made last year because Kash Patel had been unreachable behind locked doors. That's according to multiple people familiar with the request, end quote. Now, as we said, in response to this reporting, a spokesperson for the FBI called it a, quote, sweeping, malicious, and defamatory hit piece, end quote. Kash Patel claimed that it was all, quote, false. This morning, he filed a $250 million defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic. A spokesperson for The Atlantic said this, quote, we stand by our reporting on Kash Patel. We will vigorously defend The Atlantic and our journalists against this meritless lawsuit. We're back with Liz and Glenn. Glenn, this builds on things we've seen with our own eyes. Kash Patel using the taxpayer-funded airplane to go to the Olympics in Milan and guzzling beer like he's in a, 80s movie, I guess, is where those scenes were popular. They're really not very modern. There he is. If he's not drunk, I'm sorry for him. But he's certainly guzzling beer, again, on camera before our eyes. I know from interviewing Fred Trump that Donald Trump finds alcohol rather loathsome, which is just interesting. I know Pete Hegseth viewed as sort of a condition of being accepted, saying publicly to Megyn Kelly on her podcast that he would, quote, stop drinking if he got the job. He said that when his confirmation appeared to be on the rocks. How does this story play inside Trump world?
Good question. Let me start with a 2-hour disclaimer. No, we have not, I should just say before I say anything, that we have not verified any of the allegations regarding his drinking. I and I think a bunch of other reporters that Friday were chasing the story. We had heard that Patel had been locked out of his system. I have not been able, and I've reported extensively on this, to ascertain whether or not he was freaked out. I know that throughout the administration and other circumstances, folks have been freaked out in similar circumstances. But as you said, Nicole, Donald Trump, and I covered him for a long time, does not like people who drink to excess. He's had a family history of this stuff, and throughout his entire career, he has expressed an aversion to people who get intoxicated in public. This is just a fact. So this is a story regardless of Patel's pushback on this, and he claims that none of this was true, to be clear, is likely to at least raise questions in Trump's orbit at a time when Patel is not necessarily in the greatest standing. That said, since this published, and really for the last couple of weeks, we've been asking people about Patel's stability and his potential to stay on as director, really in the wake of the Bondi firing. We do not at the moment have a sense that the White House and that Trump are looking to fire him. That said, things in the last month or so have moved very quickly, and even people around Patel say that while they feel like he's in pretty good shape right now, that can change fairly quickly. And it is entirely possible to read a lot of what he's done in the last 24 or 48 hours, including this announcement that he was kind of getting back in the Wayback Machine on the 2020 election as a way of him reminding Trump of why he picked Patel in the first place. So it is a very interesting story. It comes at a particularly vulnerable moment for Patel, but I think we're just going to have to wait to see how this plays out.
Let me show you Kash Patel's response on Fox News when the story broke.
Let me ask you about the mission, because every time I see President Trump, he says this repeatedly, that the election was rigged in 2020. I mean, he says it all the time. We all know that. And it's almost getting lost because he says it so much. You've been at the FBI now 14 months. Have you done anything about that? And do you have anything to tell us about that?
Absolutely, Maria. Look, I've been with the president nearly since day one on this. We have found all this information. We are working with our Department of Justice partners, and I am never going to let this go, because they not only have personally attacked the presidency of the United States and President Trump, but they tried to thwart our elections and rig the entire system. And that is not something that is going to stop on it. That is not something I'm going to allow on my watch. Right. But you just have to remember, they built this disease temple over 20 and 30 years. We've got all the evidence. I can announce on your show that we've got all the information we need. We're working with our prosecutors at the Department of Justice and their Attorney General Todd Blanche, and we are going to be making arrests, and it's coming, and I promise you, it's coming soon.
Let everyone render their own judgments about that performance. They built this disease temple over 20 and 30 years, and we've got all the efference. I can announce on your show we've got all the information we need, blah, blah, blah. It's coming soon. Liz, your thoughts on what is in public about the current director of the FBI, Kash Patel?
It is shocking to hear the FBI director commit to making arrests, to talk about making arrests that have not yet occurred. That is a massive breach of any protocol to announce that people are going to be arrested before all the pieces are in place to actually conduct the arrests. That's not how law enforcement works. It seems very clear that Kash Patel is in desperate self-preservation mode. So he's making these promises that he thinks will help to keep him on the job. And he very well may come to regret those. I think he also very well may come to regret the announcement that he made on Fox News that he was going to bring a defamation lawsuit against The Atlantic. He did that today. He's seeking $250 million. But the first thing that Kash Patel has to prove to win that lawsuit is that these statements that were made by The Atlantic were false. That means The Atlantic will be entitled to conduct discovery into the truthfulness of the statements that they made by interviewing witnesses who may not have wanted to talk with reporters, but who will be forced under oath to talk with the reporters about whether these statements are true. That would include members of Kash Patel's security team who would have firsthand knowledge of the inability to wake him up, the need to get breaching equipment to get him out of bed. So it seems like Kash Patel could very quickly come to regret opening that Pandora's box by filing a defamation lawsuit.